Good day. Now that we've learned how integrative design enables radical energy efficiency, renewable and right-sized energy supply, and their profitable solutions to climate change and many other problems, we'll next explore the implications for hydrocarbons, energy resilience, global development, nuclear power, nuclear proliferation and global security, critical materials, energy infrastructure, and reallocation of financial capital. There are many other topics we could dig into, from jobs and equity and sociology to agriculture and geopolitics, but I'd rather save those for discussion and for our next two classes. A fundamental fact of today's global energy markets is that fossil fuel prices are volatile. If you like to invest with confidence for steady returns, you might want to look elsewhere. The volatility has many causes in supply and demand dynamics, mismatched time lags, geopolitics, domestic politics, market behaviors, and more. But you might expect reasonably for volatility to rise in places where hydrocarbon industries dominate supply mixes and political power. You might also interpret the higher returns in 2022 and 3 in this graph as reflecting temporary scarcities caused by Putin's war, rather than improved fundamentals for fossil fuels. Indeed, smarter ways to find and extract hydrocarbons become ever more challenging as fuel depletion continues, competing with better technology for finding and lifting the fuel. Now, in America's biggest oil company, half the forward oil output reportedly needs a $75 a barrel market price to justify investment as of a few years ago. And after 2025, 36% of it will need $95 a barrel. So how would this firm fare as the cost of getting U.S. autos completely off oil drops from $26 per saved barrel a decade ago to under $7 a barrel today to less than zero just a few years from now, and already for some leading automotive models? Well, capital markets are behaving accordingly. Just before Putin's war, the Financial Times editorialized that oil and gas exploration must pay up to 20% a year for capital, while renewables, with their lower project risk, better prospects, shorter lead times, pay only 3 to 5% a year. They can get as much cheap capital as they want, while Chevron and ExxonMobil must now return capital to placate investors. Such firms and OPEC Plus have bet the farm on exploration to meet durably rebounding oil demand. That looks like an ever riskier bet, given what we've learned about efficient use in electric transport. Now, to be sure, the wartime oil price spike has made oil majors flush with cash, but the underlying reality will reemerge. Aging shale plays have limited scope for further expanding output, especially if the world oil price per barrel is nearer $70 or less than $90 or more. There's a rising tension being seen between Saudi Arabia's budget need, about $95 a barrel, and what most users will pay. To be sure, oil majors' competitors face risks too, especially in political economy, as the transition makes fossil fuel prices more volatile. As Kevin Book presciently remarked in 2021, price spikes, he said, tend to usher out incumbent politicians faster than they usher in new technologies. So he said the transition may not merely be challenged by technology moving too slowly, but also by elected officials reacting too quickly and perhaps unwisely. Did all auto sales peak in 2017, or only autos with internal combustion engines? Well, Bloomberg thinks total auto sales sometime in the 2030s will modestly exceed those of 2017. Carbon Tracker and some other analysts think not, but it doesn't really matter. The important point is that sales of fueled autos in black did peak in 2017. How quickly electric vehicles take market share will determine fueled autos' degree of temporary rebound, if any. But world EV sales are sizzling. They doubled to 6.5 million from 2020 to 21. In 24, they rose to 21 million. In 2025, the world is expected to have 83 million electric cars and heavy vehicles on the road, plus 340 million with 2 or 3 wheels. In mid-decade or so, it's all downhill for fueled autos, all the more so with an under $5,000 entry-level 4-seat EV, the most popular in China. There goes the biggest use of transportation fuel, nearly all of it from oil. EVs now displace 2 million barrels of oil use per day, about a Japan's worth, out of 45 million barrels a day for road fuels, about 102 million for all uses. But prices are very sensitive to modest imbalances of 1 or 2 million barrels a day. By 2040, Bloomberg expects EVs to displace 20 million barrels a day. Again, almost half the current road fuel use. An all-electric 2050 fleet could use about 1/9 of global electricity, or much less with more efficient vehicles. But given the growth in renewables, that's very manageable and certainly worth doing for the benefits of getting rid of the oil. For all road transport, Bloomberg forecasts that fuel use will drop by more than half by 2050, reaching global peak oil in 2027, China peak oil in 2025. However, that forecast offsets fleet expansion to 2040 almost entirely with powertrain efficiency gains from electrification. But this only assumes 5% a year improvement in vehicles' fuel economies over 7 years. Since several-fold improvements are generally profitable today, this forecast looks like an upper bound for oil use. Proper attention to efficiency of the kinds we discussed, platform efficiency, not just electrification, look able to phase out oil altogether by 2050, as in Bloomberg's net zero scenario. At least most of that saving could be market-driven, though policy could help a lot. That would also greatly mitigate critical materials concern. Just for calibration, Bloomberg's battery pack sizes and hence materials needs are based on standard real-world efficiencies like 5 or 6 kilometers per kilowatt hour for U.S. battery cars in the small through SUV range. Well, that's a third the 16.9 kilometers per kilowatt hour rating of my BMW i3 out in the driveway on the U.S. 5-cycle test. Bloomberg is starting to notice such opportunities. Its heavy truck benchmark efficiency just rose 45% in a single year, although its light vehicle assessments remain, in my view, conventionally conservative. The offsetting new electricity demand for EV charging, again, will still be modest, globally about 11 or 12% of projected 2050 world electricity use. The on-peak demand is even lower, around 9% by 2050, and of course that's very adjustable by treating charging as an intelligent, flexible load. By September 2022, 20 nations and 17 automakers had set dates to phase out internal combustion engine autos, adding up to 41% of the world market for passenger vehicles. Well, such targets are also emerging for fueled trucks. And it's going to be interesting to see how lack of new fueled vehicles affects the market in used ones. To be sure, since the 2024 election, Bloomberg has dropped its U.S. Projection of EV sales share in 2030 from 48% to 33%, based on an assumption of unfavorable federal policies. And that would cut U.S. EV sales in 2030 by 2.4 million vehicles. But, the courts and states and markets are yet to be heard from, and they will have a lot to say. Many jurisdictions have sped the date from which they will no longer allow new fueled cars to be sold. By the middle of 2023, 18 national phase-out targets for fueled cars had been adopted, plus 20 European countries that'll stop it by 2035. The only big laggards absent from the right-hand graph are China, expected to end its internal combustion engine sales by 2050, but be 2/3 of the way there by 2030, and South Korea and Japan, which expect to pass 80% EVs in the early 2040s. Well, those countries all have powerful auto industries defending their legacy assets, but market forces, I think, will ultimately overcome their inertia, as is happening in China. And since this graph was published, some automakers have softened their targets, to be sure, but both regulatory and market momentum remain substantial, especially in Europe. In BP, formerly British Petroleum's canonical 2019 forecast, 79% of the growth they forecast to 2040 in global net demand for refined petroleum products would come from aviation. Its efficiency was assumed to keep improving 2% a year, as it had for decades. Even a lower carbon transport scenario didn't change that, and biofuels didn't do much. Well, today, the radically emergent future of aviation is going to squeeze its oil use between trends like virtual travel, turning jet setting into Zoom sitting, flight shaming, high-speed rail, super efficient airplanes, point-to-point route architectures, electrification, and hydrogen propulsion. That's an awful lot of competitors with this sort of forecast. Then under new BP leadership, which changed again in 2023, the firm sold its petrochemical business and began redesigning itself for 2/5 lower oil demand, with a major shift to equally or more profitable renewables and probably to efficiency. Its drastically revised 2020 forecast had 3 scenarios for the next 30 years, and they showed reductions in global hydrocarbon share ranging from significant to enormous. Up to 60% renewable share of total primary energy, not just electricity. And in 2 scenarios, efficiency gains nearly offset all economic growth. Here's the 2024 version, showing major oil shrinkage. Despite some short-term hesitation to grab short-term profits from the wartime price spike, the supertanker's rudder is now hard over. These scenarios likely extinction of coal in black and dominance of efficiency and renewables in brown, are commendable recognitions of profound market shifts underway. And that makes BP and some other majors into anti-particles of Chevron and ExxonMobil. Whether the reformers can shift their talent and capital and culture quickly enough to avoid the fate of the whalers remains to be seen, but at least they've now spotted the iceberg. Now, we saw earlier that hydrocarbons' value comes from far more from their hydrogen than their carbon. But reforming natural gas into so-called blue hydrogen using carbon capture makes money only if the cost of the gas and the reformer and the carbon capture and the use or sequestration of the carbon can beat the cost of splitting water with renewable electricity to make green hydrogen. In 2023, BP assumed the low-carbon hydrogen market will be mostly green, while solar and wind power's rapid growth will slow in the 2040s due to a supposed intermittency problem that they thought would limit renewables to a 65% share. Well, that's a big bet against cheap batteries, grid-integrated EVs, about 8 other grid flexibility resources, and cheap electrolyzers. And it's a big bet for cheap carbon capture and storage or use, and also for cheap reformers. I suspect those bets will get reframed. Moreover, the whole scenario assumed that renewable costs will drop substantially less from 2020 to 50 than Bloomberg forecasts. And BP's scenario bet against much of the advanced efficiency we've discussed in all uses. Shell's latest scenarios reflect similar limitations and surprisingly high demand. Both these firms are ahead of many other oil majors, but I think they're still lagging actual market evolution. Then there's another big shoe that hasn't yet dropped. BP and the International Energy Agency both say the biggest driver of expected growth in global oil forecasts and oil demand is no longer aviation, but petrochemicals, chiefly to make plastics. That's 45% of the total growth for IEA, 95% for BP. In their 22, I think, forecast that says feedstock uses cause a quarter to a half of 2050 oil use. And yet 2/5 of plastics end up in the environment. Microplastics are building up everywhere, from the ocean floor and the poles to food chains to human placentas. The petrochemical industry was already about $200 billion overbuilt through 2019, so it's investing $400 billion more. And making each ton of plastics also emits about 5 tons of CO2. So that industry's plans could use 10 or 20% of the world's 1.5 degree, nearly gone by now, climate budget to 2040. Plastics on an untaxed external cost to society have been estimated at about $350 billion a year, or $1,000 a ton. It's pretty expensive plastic. Now, the 2020 analysis, Breaking the Plastic Wave, suggested a system change scenario that would tax back that externality, as Europe planned to do under OECD's polluter pays principle. And then they'd meet the 2040 service demand, 16% with other materials, 22% with recycling, which covers now only 5 or 10% of production or of use, and 30% with reduced usage of plastics. So this could cut 2040 plastic demand in half and make virgin peak plastic demand occur in 2027 or so. If you combined all the feasible interventions, such studies found you could cut plastic pollution by 2/5 from the 2016 rates and around 80% from standard 2040 projections. That looks pretty sensible, and betting against such futures could be hazardous to your financial health, especially if tighter gas markets make the feedstocks costly. Irrational exuberance, however, does persist around plastics. A methane gas industry whose future depends largely on rapid growth in demand for plastics looks to me fragile and probably imprudent. Analysts still disagree about when oil demand will peak as the world moves toward energy efficiency, renewables, plastics abatement, more sensible ways to live and travel, and natural systems agriculture. Their disagreement is pretty predictable from who pays them. But unless you're an oil owner or seller of some size, either the peak is behind us or it looks close in size and in time. And of course, size and time are not fate but choice. And that choice no longer belongs just to the oil industry. This flip has been a long time coming. U.S. oil use peaked in 2005. European oil use peaked a year later. Even then, some mainstream analysts began to see peak oil not in supply but in demand. But they were dismissed, as I had been long before. But markets, policymakers, citizens had their say. In 2019, before the pandemic, fossil fuel use lost momentum. It rose only 0.7%. It fell in nearly half the world. It only met 46% of incremental energy demand. Then in 2020, under pandemic shock, Lecture 3A's story of whale oil in the 1850s repeated itself with rock oil, petroleum. And many developing countries, rather than buying efficient technologies decades later, are now leapfrogging straight to them and are dominating renewable purchases. Thus, the energy and economic future has just moved into fast forward. Here's a little history about the big picture of what that means for oil supply. Around 2006, the oil industry's conventional wisdom was that the supply curve relating global oil resources on the horizontal axis to their price in a competitive market on the vertical axis looked kind of like this. Starting at the left, about 1 trillion barrels had already been lifted and sold. About the same amount in orange remained to be extracted in Middle Eastern OPEC countries. That would be enough to meet projected oil needs to 2030. That's the pink box above the orange. And then nearly as much would be available at somewhat higher cost in other conventional resources shown in salmon. Now, reducing the Middle East share would need costly resources higher up the curve from the Arctic, tar sands, and so on to be extracted sooner. And then when fracking unexpectedly scaled up a decade later, the logic didn't really change because fracking turned out to need more than $50 a barrel on the chart. That's 70 odd in today's dollars. Around the middle, in other words, of the purple oil shale block, that big vertical block that never made economic sense. So frackers produced oil but not profits. Their business model, Bloomberg's Liam Denning said at the time, is spending money you don't have to produce energy nobody wants. The capital markets finally lost enough money to lose patience. Well, now let's splice in three missing resources in green. The big one is the 2.2 trillion barrels of efficiency that we conservatively showed in 2004 in our Pentagon co-sponsored synthesis, winning the oil endgame. And then below and left of that, there's a little green block, 250 trillion barrels at slightly negative cost from substituting saved gas for oil. And then the third green block further to the right, a bit of advanced biofuels cheaper than the ones that dominate today. So those 3 trillion added barrels slide all of the costly oil resources up towards the right. Now that substitution averts over a teraton, 1,000 gigatons of carbon emissions. That's the metric we used to use. Nowadays, you'd say about 4 teratons of CO2, and it saves tens of trillions of dollars. The rising black curve read against the right vertical axis shows the huge carbon benefits because you get two multiplying benefits. You're avoiding both the quantity and the very high carbon intensity of the costly and very dirty resources in the upper right part of the curve. You might wonder, why was the Pentagon so keen to support this work in 2003? Well, because they desperately needed to save and green the energy that their own operations use. They're arguably the biggest oil user in the world. And otherwise, energy's costs and risks could defeat their national security mission, much of which, ironically, was caused or exacerbated by oil. You saw some fruits of that attitude at the end of Lecture 3B. How has the story changed by now? Well, our original 2005 or so BP supply curve is on the left. Since then, the world has burned another 2/3 of a trillion barrels, taking today's starting point to about 1.7 trillion barrels on the horizontal axis, but drawing on diverse categories and regions, not just the Middle East. Now, drawn to the same vertical and horizontal scale, the same vertical scale, but not the same horizontal scale. A respected supply curve of liquid oil resources that remained in 2020 included some oil sands, some added shales called NA for North America tight liquids, to show the total liquids of 1.4 trillion barrels. It's about comparable to the 3 trillion barrel mark on the left graph. Monetary inflation is not shown in the right-hand graph. It's about a third. So an $80 resource on the right would be about $56 on the left. But the two curves, you notice, are qualitatively similar. So far, technology offsetting depletion. However, the costlier resources toward the right are in a race to find markets before several trillion negabarrels show up, now being rapidly developed, and keep the hydrocarbons in the ground right where they are, where I expect they'll mainly stay, doing their vital task of holding up the ground. Now, there are two potential silver linings for hydrocarbon owners. The first, which is vital to preserve their license to operate, is to abate their emissions of methane, a global warming gas 2 orders of magnitude more potent than CO2. This burgeoning threat is better known than its profitable solutions. Most of it's coming from upstream oil and gas operations, often intentionally emitting methane from flares and from what are euphemistically called engineered vents. Like you design a system so a tank gets to an excessive pressure, so it automatically vents for safety, releasing methane. Well, because that was done for safety deliberately in an engineered vent, not accidentally, it's not an accidental escape. So we often don't realize how big the engineered vents are. Of course, methane decomposes so quickly in the atmosphere that, as the lower right graph shows, just profitable abatements of those deliberate releases could stabilize and even reverse the global methane cycle, creating profits and heroes. A few thousand sites in about a dozen countries could do this if the operators paid attention, or perhaps if a trusted big partner rolled up the opportunity for profitable abatement, offering the smaller operators a shared savings deal. IEA has done a series of analyses like this. They estimated 2020 releases were 5 to 12 times the abatement you would need to stabilize the global methane cycle. And they said that virtually all abatement measures in the oil and gas sector could be deployed cost effectively, that means profitably, over the next 10 years, and about 2/3 of measures in the coal sector as well, because many operating and closed coal mines emit a lot of methane. At COP26, methane abatement finally began to be seen as the fastest way to turn down the global thermostat. But in 2023, the head of IEA blasted hydrocarbon companies for doing little with, he said, no excuse to abate methane, even as they drowned in temporary profits. IEA's global methane tracker finds about 80% of the industry's upstream abatements would now make money. That opportunity is still there and even a bit bigger. Meanwhile, the president of Mitsui OSK Lines, which is a major shipper, marine shipper, revealed another opportunity in 2024. He pointed out that many older LNG-fueled marine vessels, often using low-pressure dual-fuel four-stroke engines, emit more than twice as much unburned methane as the EU assumes, or 80% more than the International Maritime Organization assumes. So LNG vessels are a lot more problematic than we thought. Now, owners' second advantage is that the hydrogen in their hydrocarbons is worth more without the carbon than with the carbon, even if carbon emissions are not priced. You can use hydrogen more effectively than hydrocarbons, so the owners can make more profit removing hydrogen with a reformer than adding hydrogen with a refinery. But now, splitting water with green electricity may well beat hydrocarbons regardless. There's some argument about that because people have different views of what electrolyzers will cost, but they too are progressing nicely. And as we'll see in a moment, there might be an even cheaper method. Now, IEA has published, this is 2021, I believe, a policy blueprint to cut global methane emissions 70% in this decade. Hydrocarbon industry leaders would be smart to shift from compliance mode to entrepreneurial mode, and to consider the opportunity not just in their own operations, but in everyone's, because it only takes one big oil company or service company to do a global roll-up and thus become heroes to their shareholders and all beings. Especially in the US, the second biggest methane emitter, but a little ahead of Russia in emission intensity, the hydrocarbon industries, even Texas regulators, are starting to step up. And they have little choice because new methane imaging satellites and data fusion platforms, including RMI's Climate Intelligence Initiative, leave emitters nowhere to hide, and you can't lie about your emissions anymore. I want to mention two wildcards about fuels. First, BP and its kin project that pretty gas-rich futures, and they may be betting on new technologies like one developed for ARPA-E and now funded by Shell RMI's venture arm third derivative, I see, is also an investor. Now, if this one succeeds and if upstream methane emissions become negligible, say under 0.1%, it may offer more options for safely using natural gas for longer. So we can't yet exclude that. Refineries and other bulk users now make nearly all the world's hydrogen in giant SMRs, steam methane reformers. Those catalytically react natural gas with hot steam. The methane and the steam each contribute half the hydrogen that comes out. And this method makes gray hydrogen. It's called that because it releases CO2. Capturing or storing that CO2, making the hydrogen blue, would add cost. Some say and others deny that blue hydrogen is relatively climate safe if methane doesn't leak from the gas system. So that's still in dispute. Now, the new process mentioned here produces only half as much hydrogen as steam methane reformers, but at comparable unit cost. Because instead of raising steam, it bubbles methane up through a column of catalytic molten metal akin to the molten tin bath used to make float glass. And nearly all the methane cracks to pure hydrogen. The rest could heat the metal, while the carbon continuously and conveniently skims off the top of the metal as a granular pure solid, kind of like sand. It requires no chemical separation. The big question for the developer, C0.com, is whether ever cheaper renewable electricity can make even cheaper green hydrogen as electrolyzers get mass produced at much lower cost, kind of like automotive fuel cells run backwards, and start exploiting their flexibility as a controllable load and as a lucrative way to use surplus renewable power when it's cheap and abundant, maybe negative cost. Another line of inquiry is around making the carbon co-product of methane pyrolysis that you skim off the top into carbon nanotubes, potentially cheap enough to displace structural metals for a multiple win, especially by using the ultralight lattice structures that we mentioned in 3B for airplanes. Now, second, for decades, I've been curious about mainly Russian historical interest in the possibility of geological or natural hydrogen, which Mendeleev measured in 1888 in Ukraine. But, you know, it is said that the original Olympic flame was lit from a Turkish seep known for thousands of years. But geologic or natural hydrogen was ignored in the West and by major hydrocarbon companies. They didn't look for it, and they weren't equipped to detect it. This is a really hard to believe fact. When companies drilled and then used gas chromatography to look at what molecules were coming up the hole, they used hydrogen as their carrier gas. So if hydrogen were coming up the well, they couldn't see it because it didn't occur to them to look for it. Amazing. Anyway, in this past decade, attention has risen, and in 2023, it exploded. Now there's a big USGS study. There's an American Association of Petroleum Geologists Committee, as it's become clear that this may be a teraton, trillion-ton resource with enough of it recoverable to run the world for centuries. And it may even be renewable. It may be getting continuously regenerated by hot pressurized water catalyzed by iron-rich rock, for example, at depth. Now, startup firms are starting to find natural hydrogen in many parts of the world at affordable depths, typically in regions that lack hydrocarbons, including much of Africa. That's because geological hydrogen is generally in areas of volcanic origin with mafic rock rather than sedimentary basins that accumulate hydrocarbons. So maybe you can get one or the other. That would be very interesting geopolitically. Some firms with encouraging initial finds think that the net cost at the wellhead for geological hydrogen could be close to zero because very valuable co-product gases can about pay for the drilling. Well, in many areas, costly hydrogen pipelines or other transportation may not be needed because you can drill the well with modest impact right where you need the hydrogen, or a customer, maybe a steel or cement plant, could locate right where the hydrogen is. And most interestingly, if geological hydrogen turns out to be as ubiquitous, cheap, and benign as some initial indications suggest it might be, not for sure, it could put Mideast oil owners out of business. It could compete with and complement solar, wind power, perhaps efficiency. It could scramble much of what we thought we knew about the whole energy transition. So watch this space. Now, the global ratio of investment in non-fossil to fossil energy has gone from 1 to 2 over the past less than a decade. Renewables in dark green are attracting a lot more capital than fossil fuels in red, if you, I should say dark green and light green if you include the grids and storage that go with the renewables, and then efficiency in a sort of funny mauve color. Now, hydrocarbon firms are reinvesting less than half of their windfall from Putin's war into new hydrocarbons, only about 4% into clean energy. Instead, they're reinvesting mostly in share buybacks and debt reduction to try to keep their nervous shareholders on board by paying them a large risk premium. That's not a sign of strength. That premium may soar if investors think that natural hydrogen might drastically reduce oil resources' long-term value. Of course, major hydrocarbon firms are now paying belated attention to that risk, but there isn't a lot they can do about it, and they prefer to let the smaller pioneers take the risk while they themselves try even more urgently to cash in their own carbon-rich reserves while they can. They don't seem very enthusiastic about investing in their potential nemesis any more than traditional automakers originally were in investing in the EVs that are killing their legacy products. Okay, how about other surprises? Well, occasional bursts of concern about rare earth elements have created price spikes profitable for some speculators and stock hypesters at the expense of gullible investors, as in rare earths. Then, more recently, cobalt and lithium and nickel. Well, those investors get fleeced because of their limited understanding of how scarcity pricing triggers not just mineral exploration and extraction, but also 3 other powerful market responses: efficiency, substitution, and loop closing, which is nicely described in an RMI publication called the Back Loop, where you can look at the operations of redwood materials. More carefully examined, rare earths are not a serious issue, although short-term Chinese processing dominance does merit and is getting attention. But with rare earths, just as in battery metals, you need a whole systems perspective. I'm afraid that the popular press, many politicians, even most government and analyst publications, outfits that should know better, DOE, DOD, IEA, are taking a narrow and rather naive view of critical materials economics. Copper was lately the crisis du jour, based partly on claims like IEA's that EVs need 2.3 times more copper than equivalent gasoline cars. Well, good design can make that number approximately 1 or less. How do we know that? Well, because our hypercar spinoff did a nearly 600 line item bill of materials on a complete design with a couple of European tier 1s. That's what we found. Or recall when we were talking about aviation, that Denso Honeywell motor with a 1/5 to a 1/10 the weight per kilowatt of most current EV motors. Another fun way to save battery minerals, this time in buildings, is to eliminate batteries for most portable electronics, like remote control units, thermostats, smoke detectors, a whole myriad devices that are part of the Internet of Things. The European Union estimates that such European battery disposals for little stuff are running about 78 million batteries a day. Well, low light, dye-sensitized photovoltaics meant to run indoors on ambient stray light can be at least 40% efficient. You can print them in bulk at very low cost. They can be flexible, stable, adequate for what you're trying to run, especially if it's efficient. Like the old Fraunhofer cell phone that was powered solely by its user's voice using power-starved electronics, so you never needed to provide external power to it. There is one more national security issue arising from currently fractious geopolitics and its interplay with U.S. domestic politics, even more fractious. China, shown here in red, is adding upwards of half the world's new renewable supply, 3/5 of the world's new electric vehicles, and China had the foresight to build a dominant position in those supply chains. Some less provident countries, like the U.S., are now scrambling to reduce their dependence on Chinese industrial capacity. This problem will, in time, solve itself, much sped by the Inflation Reduction Act and Bipartisan Infrastructure Act in 22, and similar European efforts sparked by Putin's war. But for a few more years, this graph will still provoke anxiety. Happily, as we see from the previous page of battery metal prices, market mechanisms work also in Chinese industries that sell into global markets. Another lately popular claim from the disinformation portfolio is that solar and wind power will use too much land. Well, for wind power, this typically reflects a confusion between the area actually occupied by physical infrastructure and the roughly 100-fold larger area that it spans across, of which 97 to 99% continues to be used for farming, ranching, wildlife, and recreation, and often paying wind royalties larger than the farmer or rancher makes from agriculture, which continues. Now, counting the spanned area, not the occupied area, is a mistake, like saying that the area of the lamppost is a parking lot is the area of the parking lot. But then where do you park? Of course, the other 99% or so is occupied by cars or empty slots or driving space, not by the lamppost. Those are small. Now, a Nature paper with these maps shows that the world could get all its electricity from rooftop solar using no land, operable with or without the grid, and avoiding the delivery costs and losses and glitches. Buildings can additionally and valuably put photovoltaics on their vertical surfaces, including windows. Ground mount solar, the usual utility scale kind, is now often built atop crop or livestock production, typically increasing the ag production and the profit from the same land. This is called agrivoltaics or agri-solar. Or you can build solar on otherwise unusable land like landfills, canals, brownfields, or you can fill it into wind farms. Even standalone ground mount solar uses slightly less land than nuclear power, including its fuel cycle, which is usually left out. And wind power uses 1 or 2 orders of magnitude less land than solar does. Anyway, few places are going to run on solar alone. So add all this up, and it's clear that land use by solar power is not an important constraint. On the contrary, rooftop PVs are already about 2/5 of globally installed PV capacity and 1/4 of annual additions, or about 2/3 in China a few years ago under the whole county rooftop solar program. And of course, distributed solar provides uniquely resilient power supply over a big range of scales, although now regional grids and storage need to catch up. As Vietnam and Pakistan showed, they can spread extremely quickly. If allowed to compete fairly, These distributed resources challenge utility-scale renewables and transmission grids. Australia just installed its 4 millionth rooftop PV system. They add up to 25 gigawatts. That's more than the coal capacity of what was very long a coal-dominated nation, but the coal's going away fast. More on that later. Now, another advantage of efficiency and of distributed renewable energy systems is starting to speed their adoption. As poverty persists and natural disasters intensify and physical attacks spread and cyber threats mount, one attribute that many energy users increasingly value is resilience, the system's ability to keep working or to resist damage and then quickly recover and bounce back stronger. Our book in '82 for the Pentagon on the vulnerabilities and resilient redesign of what is now called energy critical infrastructure remains the definitive unclassified work, although it predated cyber vulnerabilities added later by the same stupid assumption of no evildoers out there. Today's utility executives typically rank these once ignored concerns at the top of their worry list, and some of them, although not enough yet, are starting to take effective countermeasures. Now, wherever you live, if you have grid electricity, you probably realize it is vital and yet vulnerable. Modern societies face an increasingly existential threat from cascading and potentially economy-shattering blackouts caused by accident or malice. They're caused by squirrels, often the biggest cause, tree limbs, operator errors, earthquakes, superstorms, hot or cold snaps. They can also come from solar storms, electromagnetic pulse, and increasingly physical or cyber attack. Perhaps the biggest deliberate grid attack so far in 2012 in India blacked out 670 million people, 9% of the world's population. 2 years later, 140 million Pakistanis were blacked out to destabilize the government. On the night of the Boston Marathon bombing, the U.S. escaped major economic and political disruption when highly trained but still apparently unknown attackers were luckily interrupted minutes before shooting out the last and most important row of transformers at the Metcalf substation powering Silicon Valley. In 2022, the Department of Homeland Security warned that domestic far-right extremists have been making credible, specific plans to attack U.S. electricity systems, and some have since tried to do so. Cyber attack, as Iran recently did to Turkey and Russia to Ukraine, could be far more serious. Lloyd says that a few weeks of blackout just in the northeastern U.S. could cost $1 trillion, and some forms of attack could be irrecoverable. Britain spy masters have warned that Russia may anonymously turn off the national grid. More and fiercer storms, greater terrorism, asymmetric and hybrid warfare make resilience far more valuable. And yet basic grid protection is still in its infancy. Any serious attack would create a clamor for resilient solutions if there's a civilization left to respond. In the United States, national security experts are rightly worried about the grid, so they do regular war games. In 2009, for example, U.S. utilities and security agencies partnered with the Departments of Energy and Defense to simulate an attack on the electric grid. In that war game, a terrorist group took out extremely high voltage EHV transformers at 2 substations and blacked out a city. Then they threatened to black out 10 more cities in the next 6 hours if their demands were not met. Forces scrambled to try to protect 2,000 EHV transformers scattered across the country. After 6 hours, the attackers hit the control and communication systems instead, taking out 36 gigawatts of a major utility's capacity. They threatened to repeat in 5 hours, but there was too little time to protect the control systems. Game over. That such a capable large-scale attack has not yet happened in real life is due more to luck than precaution. Although the industry is starting to awaken to the depth of this threat, many utilities, a few years ago I would have said 2/3, have so far done little, if anything. And this chart is by former RMI military principal Scott Pugh, a retired Navy nuclear submarine captain who went on to lead the Department of Homeland Security's grid security efforts. The threats I just mentioned are from its upper right range, that is higher probability and higher consequence, but there are many others too, and they are not mutually exclusive. Another existential threat to power grids is bad space weather. The National Academies reported in 2008 that sooner or later, on a few minutes' notice, a geomagnetic storm caused by a giant solar flare, you might think of it as a starburp, could destroy any loaded EHV transformer not protected by fairly cheap means, a $10,000 or $15,000 shunt to ground and another $100,000 device. Today, that's probably most of the 2,000 or so such transformers. So that would mean no more backbone transmission for years, if ever. At least 3 events capable of damaging those transformers have occurred since 1972. One in 1989 knocked out 5 Quebec lines carrying 9 gigawatts, collapsed that province's grid in 92 seconds and caused 200 events across North American power systems. In 2003, another triggered a $4 to $10 billion blackout across Northern Europe and disabled key satellites and the Federal Aviation Administration's GPS navigation system. A 1921 storm was 10 times bigger than those. A 1972 solar storm, unexpectedly detonated many U.S. naval sea mines in North Vietnam. And back in 1859, in the famous Carrington event, that was 22 years before the world's first power station, a monster solar storm induced such big currents in the internet of that day, the telegraph system, that some telegraph operators ran without batteries and others had to put out fires in their stations. Spectacular auroras lit the skies as far south as Tahiti. Perhaps the most intense solar flare yet observed, that is in modern equipment, is in 2001. Luckily, most of it just missed the Earth. 4 X-class, that is major solar flares, occurred in 2017, near misses in 2020, 2024, and our sun may be capable of far larger super flares with the power of 1 trillion hydrogen bombs. Stars similar to ours have just been found to produce such a super flare about once every century, 30 times more often than was previously believed. So this is an evolving threat. This photogenic filamentary mass ejection from the sun gives you the idea, with a little Earth added at the bottom to show the scale. Grid protection from solar burps is cheap and quick, but most owners have dragged their feet for a decade or two while they argue about who pays. The current peak, 2025, in the 11-year solar storm cycle is one of the most intense yet observed. These are not rare events. It's just that most of them go off in other directions. But unprotected power grids are living on borrowed time. And I remember in the Defense Science Board Energy Task Force, Jim Schlesinger and I agreed that the Secretary of Defense should use Defense Production Act authority to just fix the problem and then argue about whose budget it goes on. But that hasn't happened yet. So either cyber terrorism or geomagnetic superstorm could destroy our national economy if we don't take prompt, careful, comprehensive precautions. The first of those risks, cyber terrorism, is threatened. The second, the solar storm, is inevitable. If that 1921 storm recurred today, it could black out over 130 million Americans, risk destruction of over 350 EHV transformers, and take many years to fix at a cost of trillions of dollars per year. Those transformers are not made in the US and in the best of times have a lead time of years. That would be about as devastating as a high-altitude nuclear blast's feared electromagnetic pulse, EMP. And sooner or later, one of those things is bound to happen. A single, say, North Korean high-altitude nuclear explosion requiring no guidance and no reentry technology could probably destroy much of the North American grid, and probably a lot of distributed electronics too, including many solar inverters and controllers, which should be required to be EMP hardened, but aren't. It's not very hard to do, and it should routinely be built into our critical infrastructure, including distributed power supply. So in all, we are woefully unprepared. Most of our anti-blackout precautions do not avert these larger threats. Some could make them worse. For the same reason that suppressing forest fires intensifies the next fire that you fail to suppress. My solar-powered net positive home has for a quarter century worked continuously with or without the grid, except twice when a battery cell failed, so we had to rely at night solely on wind power from the grid. When I'm staying somewhere else, I'm always surprised when I wake up in the morning and the lights are still on. Major blackouts so far, like these two, are quickly recoverable events, even across a very large area. But a bad one might pull the United States out of its complacency by putting us back in the 7th century. Botnets, malware, Stuxnet, thousands of probing attacks on utilities every day, and actual blackouts and extortions of foreign utilities are now commonplace. Yet our institutions have done little since that Defense Science Board panel, co-chaired by former Secretary of Defense and Energy Jim Schlesinger, surfaced the cyber issue in 2008. Now, connecting distributed generators so they work safely and reliably with or without the grid has been the Pentagon strategy for powering military bases. Very sensible. But strangely, it is seldom available to the civilians whom the Pentagon defends. When Superstorm Sandy blacked out more than 2 million New Jersey households, as in the left photo, for days, nearly all the 1+ gigawatt of rooftop photovoltaics survived. Even the ones that flew away were often okay when they landed, but all of them had been wired not to work without the grid. This was based on an old concern that line workers might not carry out their standard safety procedures of assuming that every wire is live, kind of like in gun safety, assuming every gun is loaded. And then if your solar system was feeding power back into the grid during a blackout, someone could get electrocuted. Well, today's industry consensus standards can keep hookups resilient and line workers safe. Because IEEE standard 1547 does exactly that. It allows safe manual islanding. It was approved in 2003. It's been updated to let smarter inverters auto island. So that means if the grid fails, for example, my solar system on the roof above my head here will isolate from the grid, keeping the line workers safe. However, interior inverters in the house will restart those inverters on the roof in isolation from the grid if there is sunlight, if it's daytime, and keep charged my battery bank, which will run us right through the night. And of course, if it's at night, that will continue to power all our critical loads. So the whole building is an uninterruptible power supply. Well, then we can reorganize distributed renewables into local microgrids that normally interconnect, but can split apart fractally at need, stand alone, serve critical loads, and then when the grid reconnects, sense that, wait a while to make sure it's real, not just a reclose or transient, and then resynchronize and reconnect. Regulators should allow and encourage this. At least they should not allow utilities to prohibit it, as many do, if their mindset is still in the knife switch days instead of the power electronics and software days. Now, obviously, solar on the roof of your home, office, factory, school, hospital can shield you from grid interruptions, But that also makes your power supply about 50 to 100 times more reliable because it bypasses the fragile grid where nearly all power failures start. Industry and regulators should also encourage and help utilities to rewire every gasoline filling station with photovoltaics and batteries. So in a blackout, they can still pump fuel. Otherwise, first responders, gensets, the whole recovery process from, say, a superstore will soon grind to a halt. Over the July 4th holiday 2019 in our own valley here in western Colorado, a wildfire across the street from our office took out 5 of the 6 wooden pole power lines, and it came within 1 minute of blacking out nearby Aspen for at least a week at the height of the summer season, when the last remaining power line was very luckily saved because just as it was catching on fire, a utility worker happened to pass by in a utility truck, saw it happening, and had a working fire extinguisher in his truck. Our electric co-op here is looking into solarizing our valley's 11 gas stations, making mobility fuel depend as it does now on electric grid power is unnecessary and stupid. We should fix it. The kinds of insights you've just heard come largely from or grow out of our previously mentioned 1982 synthesis of domestic energy vulnerability and resilience. I wrote it with my then wife and colleague L. Hunter Lovins for the Pentagon in 1980-81. And after passing classification review, it got a forward from President Nixon's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Undersecretary of the Navy, Jim Woolsey, who later went on to run the CIA. It was warmly received in the national security community. It was summarized in an Atlantic article on your reading list. And there's an early OCR scan, you can probably spot the typos, posted free at rmi.org. Brittle power first laid out the frightening vulnerability of existing over-centralized energy systems to many kinds of disruption, some severe enough to threaten national survival. It was documented to over 1,200 references, many from newspaper clippings. This was before the internet. And it documented the very frequent use of attacks on energy systems, especially power grids, as a rewarding tool of asymmetric warfare. It was happening very frequently in 1980. Now, of course, it's Russia's go-to tactic against Ukraine. Although cyber vulnerabilities, also now much used, had not yet become an issue, as they later did. Building on those examples and on biology and various engineering disciplines, the book's chapter 13 then synthesized how to design inherently resilient energy or other systems to make major failures not inevitable by design, but impossible by design. And we elaborated how to get it done. Here's a quick summary of those design principles. To withstand shocks, reduce harm, recover quickly and smarter. An inherently resilient system should include many small fine-grained elements dispersed in space, each having a low cost of failure. The substitutable components should be richly interconnected by short redundant links. Failed components or links should be promptly detected, isolated, and repaired. Organizing the components so each element can interconnect with the rest at will, but stand alone in need. And so that each successive layer of function is little affected by failures or substitutions at a lower, subordinate level. Systems should be designed so any failures are slow and graceful. Components should be understandable, maintainable, reproducible at various scales, capable of rapid evolution and learning, and societally compatible. Now, you notice this approach to architecting resilient systems defines resilience as much more than the currently popular definition of just being able to withstand a shock, keep going, and recover promptly. Is inspired by biology, we also incorporated an important aspect of active learning from the shock. then the system becomes more resilient and bounces back stronger and smarter. As in evolutionary biology, stress is the teacher and molds success and filters out failure. Besides vulnerable grids, every kind of electricity generator can fail catastrophically, some more than others. For example, at the upper left of the heavy line in this 2002 map, which I think has not been publicly updated since, there's a 103-mile joint line rail corridor coming out of Wyoming and carrying almost all the Powder River Basin coal, which historically was 2/5 of U.S. coal use. After heavy rains in 2005, 2 coal trains derailed on consecutive days, disrupting shipments or reducing them for most of the rest of that year, and more than doubling the spot price of coal. Now, of course, Wyoming's coal economy is faltering as demand begins to collapse. Power plants and their fuel supplies are also weather sensitive. In 2011, a cold snap shut down 50 fossil-fueled power plants in Texas that weren't prepared for burst pipes and frozen coal piles. Those lessons then went unlearned, more on that shortly, and such failures spanned from Texas to the East Coast early in 2023. In normally cold places like, say, Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, recent polar vortices are only the latest of many episodes of frozen coal piles, oil barges stuck on frozen rivers, power plants that won't start, failed pipelines. Even the extraordinary winter of 1917-18 might recur. That's when Baltimore Harbor had up to meter-thick ice. Most of the eastern states' infrastructure was paralyzed. Climate change is likely to make such extreme events more frequent and more severe, and all this suggests the resilience value of not needing fuel. In contrast to central power plants, efficiency and renewables are highly resilient. They perform exceptionally well under stress. Efficiency gives you generally the most bounce per buck, because by reducing how much energy we need, it stretches inadequate supplies and it buys time to improvise new supplies or fix what's broken. Renewables have no fuel supply to be interrupted. Distributed renewables are also as close as your roof, so they don't depend on the brittle grid. To capture those advantages and design more broadly for resilience, I would suggest you consider 6 design principles. First, expect a lot of stuff to go wrong, maybe for a long time. Next, since buildings use 3/4 of U.S. electricity, it's especially important to make our buildings as much as we can super efficient, net zero or net positive, both new and retrofit. It'll take a while. Anything that big takes decades, but we need to start and pursue it aggressively, and not just for energy, but also for water and, if possible, sanitation. And meanwhile, it would be smart to design out pipeline gas. You could, if needed, use local biogas, eventually perhaps add hydrogen. But the pipeline gas requires that pressure into the distribution system be continuously maintained. If it isn't, you have to shut the system off and then tediously go around to every appliance in every house served by gas, safely starting it up again so nothing blows up meanwhile. And of course, pipelines can be sabotaged in hardware or software, as it appears allegedly Russia did to our big Colonial pipeline in the US years ago. Now, another important principle is to make mobility efficient, electric, ideally solar self-charging, as those come on the market, shared and connected. so that we can get around without, again, depending on our most fragile systems, especially the very complex liquid fuel supply logistics. And better still, be already where you want to be, design out the need for most transport by co-location, integration, smarter urban design, walking, biking, e-biking, vehicle and ride sharing, mobility as a service, autonomy if we get that. Then we should make sure that our telecoms and our fuel logistics do not depend on the electric grid. That's kind of obvious, and means paying a lot more attention to resilient electric supplies for the cellular system and for, say, our fiber optic systems. Then, of course, the electricity supply itself should be diverse, distributed, renewable, islandable, resilient. And local food production, ideally organic with almost no inputs and self-fueling. And evolving local economies toward greater self-reliance, efficiency, and resilience. That's a big interlocking web of things to do to build resilience from the bottom up. If we do it, we'll be glad. If we don't, we'll wish we had. And it also was part of RMI's 1980s economic renewal project, which helped distressed energy communities in particular to devise from the bottom up a sustainable local economy. In fact, the first one we did that in was right down the road here in Carbondale, which had and lost 2 metallurgical coal mining plants, and is now absolutely flourishing, having done the things that the citizens figured out using our tools. I'm hoping to get that library of workbooks and casebooks reposted, perhaps someday even updated. Now, you'll remember how Denmark has almost entirely reorganized its power grid. On the left is a 2019 update of the grid, and on the right, a 2021 generator update with district heating plants in green and distributed electricity and combined heat and power plants as well. And many of those, which I recently visited, are actually fueled with straw or other agricultural wastes. It's a largely agricultural country. Denmark is also experimenting with reorganizing its grid as a cellular network of islandable microgrids. And they're being careful, as I found at the CHP plants, to build it using local skills, local hardware, and make sure that the local farm boy gearheads can repair anything that needs to be fixed. Now, the same resilient grid architecture, with Chinese help, enabled Cuba to reduce its serious blackout days from 224 days in 2005 to 0 days in 2007. In other words, they took 2 years to go from a dreadfully unreliable grid to a completely reliable grid, at least at scale. And they were able the next year to sustain vital services, even when 2 hurricanes in 2 weeks shredded their eastern grid. And they repeated that success in 2017. They need to do more of that again, because now some of their really old Soviet-era geriatric oil-fired plants are becoming impossible to maintain, and they are getting blackouts again, some very serious. But they've proven how to fix that. And in 2010, I actually wrote up Cuba's example for U.S. theater commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan, who, like their hosts, wanted to rebuild damaged power grids resiliently to stop frequent attacks. But the White House at the time required that the grids be rebuilt the old way, highly centralized, highly vulnerable, so the attacks continued. At one point, Baghdad was one attack away from losing all its power. In the first Trump administration, the White House and the Secretary of Energy, although not as departmental experts, were fixated on trying to bail out coal and nuclear plants that were failing in the marketplace. And they came up with a really imaginative argument, which was then rejected 5-0 by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, which then included 4 Trump appointees. And the idea was that coal and nuclear plants had fuel on hand that somehow makes them more resilient than gas-fired plants, which depends on pipelines plus any local gas storage, and also certainly more resilient than renewables, which were assumed to be unreliable despite their superior performance in major storms in recent years. Now, the biggest fallacy of this argument, bigger than gas's widespread dependence on just-in-time pipeline delivery, is kind of obvious when you think about it. The coal and nuclear plants absolutely depend on the big transmission grid that causes nearly all blackouts. Well, that's not a way to prevent blackouts. As of a few years ago, less than 1/1,000,000th of U.S. power outage hours had been caused by lack of power plant fuel. And those were actually due to coal supply problems. So the fuel on hand argument was laughed out of the room, but it may keep haunting energy policy until the courts firmly declare it contrary to the evidence. And actually, in January 2025, an energy emergency declaration blames renewables for endangering national security by being intermittent. And it therefore excludes solar and wind power, along with efficiency and batteries, I believe, from its list of approved energy resources, whatever that means. And as weather becomes more extreme, with both grids and central power plants become inherently more vulnerable. A very good illustration of this is what you might call messing with Texas. Let me walk you through what happened. In February 2021, when the customary wave of surprise spread across Texas as a surge of Arctic air severely disrupted electric supply for 4 or 5 days. That killed hundreds of people and wrought social and economic havoc and was the state's costliest ever disaster. A small percentage of customers who bought their electricity at wholesale prices by direct debit lost their life savings in days. I don't know whether the state bailed them out because Texas lets customers do what no state lets car drivers do, drive with no commercial insurance or self-insurance. And those providers had no crisis plan that would self-execute in real time. As the disaster unfolded, reporting and commentary quickly split along political fault lines. Conservative politicians and pundits, led by the governor, blamed wind power, which did have some frozen inland turbines, and those contributed a few gigawatts of the roughly 34 gigawatts of supply shortfall. Wall Street Journal editorialists kept blasting out pieces ignoring their own newspaper's correct reportage, and their editorials became instant classics for the thesis of the book, How to Lie with Statistics. Even after a tsunami of critiques, the editorialists still insisted that wind power took the worst hit. They calculated that as a percent of capacity not operating compared with installed capacity, rather than output compared to the winter output that the power pool ERCOT had actually forecast and was counting on getting, but didn't. Well, despite some frozen blades, wind power exceeded the relevant forecast, as you can see in the blue line at the bottom, for all but 10 hours. They underperformed by maximum 1.2 gigawatts for 1 hour, 18 hours into the blackouts, which obviously, therefore, they didn't cause. And meanwhile, over 30 gigawatts of thermal generation was down. Solar power worked fine as well. And in fact, over 4/5 of all the lost output was from failed non-renewables that normally provide 3/4 of Texas electricity at that time. About 3/4 of those losses were from gas-fired plants. Wind power works fine in cold places, Minnesota, Antarctica. Gas wells don't freeze in Alaska or Siberia, but Texas gas and electric asset owners failed to winterize their plants, as federal authorities had urged them to do after similar failures a decade earlier, but couldn't force them to do. Texas carefully avoids federal jurisdiction by isolating its grid from neighboring states, about 99%. Texas authorities therefore controlled what happened. They made winterization voluntary, so almost no owners did it. And even today, it remains voluntary, opaque, and very incomplete for gas. Although the last few cold snaps, they have done better than 21. Coal piles and gas wellheads and pipes froze too. That added to power plant failures, which couldn't get their gas, and scarce gas was prioritized from power plants to households because few of the power plant owners had paid extra for firm contracts. And on top of all that, many distribution wires went down. But I haven't yet mentioned the root cause of the disaster that was and still is largely ignored. That's the poor insulation of older houses, especially electrically heated ones, which dominate. See, Texas had no statewide energy standards till 2001. Now they follow the severely obsolete 2013 international standard, or ASHRAE standard. Well, because so many houses were built with little or no insulation and a lot of air leaks, that greatly increased peak heating needs, and it quickly made unheated houses dangerously cold. For example, there were a couple of 1914 houses near each other in Austin. One of them went to 2 degrees C after 8 hours without heat and went below freezing the next day, so the family was forced out. A similar house nearby had been insulated and air tightened, and even though its ventilation heat recovery was disabled by the power outage, it never went below 10.5 C, and neither the people nor the pipes froze. The people just put on sweaters. Electricity providers also had no way to offer customers that they could curtail their use and earn up to $9 per saved kilowatt hour, which was the market price cap that suppliers soon reached. One expert estimated later that 10 million each of smart water heaters and smart thermostats could have avoided at least half the curtailments and could have been added within a year. Still not done, of course. They're not being required. Well, no doubt the next Texas policy debate will be about adding a capacity market to subsidize losers, raise prices, and encourage overbuilding more of the same fossil fuel plants that didn't work or couldn't get gas. Because, of course, the problem was not lack of capacity, it was lack of operable, deliverable capacity. A capacity market, if set up like most are, would pay for capacity of approved types, whether or not that capacity proves actually able to deliver when you need it. I also doubt that efficiency retrofits get similar attention or priority, even rhetorically. The political game is to come up with ways to subsidize the gas and gas-fired power industries. However, Texas is really good at building stuff, and their supply-side prowess added 6 gigawatts of batteries and nearly 10 gigawatts of solar power in 2024 alone. And that was stimulated a year earlier when the sudden loss of a 1.3 gigawatt Texas nuclear unit in a substation fire was instantly offset by emergency response, largely or wholly from batteries. Texas policy also makes electricity prices immensely volatile. That makes battery arbitrage far more profitable. More on that later. In fact, let's go there now. In Australia, that's the opposite picture. Thermal plants intermittency in extreme heat is the grid operator's biggest headache in Australia. Largely due to heat waves in early 2017, 14% of the coal and gas capacity failed during critical peak demand periods in 3 states. The next summer brought many major coal unit failures, and in the 13th one, a new 1.1 gigawatt lignite unit that provided a fifth of Victoria's power abruptly lost half a gigawatt. And the wholesale prices, the black line on the right-hand scale, just went astronomical. It soared 15,000%. Seeing even higher prices in the adjacent state of South Australia, a Tesla big battery injected over 30 megawatts into the sagging big grid for over an hour and cashed in on the high prices. Days earlier, those batteries had recharged the surplus power priced at negative 1,000 Australian dollars a megawatt hour. That is, they would pay you to take the power. So take better than free power and then sell it at extremely high prices in a blackout. Good deal. Some analysts proposed with rich irony that heat-vulnerable fossil plant operators should be obliged to firm their brittle output with heat-safe resources like renewables and batteries, just the way U.S. coal interests demand that solar and wind power be firmed, but with fossil power. In another noted half-gigawatt lignite plant outage a year early, the Tesla big battery here, 1,000 kilometers away, had responded in milliseconds to stabilize frequency, which was already being restored before the contracted frequency stabilizing resource at Queensland coal plant could even start to respond. At that time, South Australia was only half wind and solar power, and it had subsidized that big battery late in 2017 to prevent a repetition of an embarrassing grid collapse they just had, caused mainly by a gas plant failure and operator error. While the battery was promised to be built in 100 days from signature of the contract, the signature took 203 days, then construction took 63 days. But starting a day before the official opening, that battery often helped stabilize the regional grid. In 2019 alone, it was said to cut grid costs by more than its own likely construction cost. Real fast payback. The next year, South Australia's three big batteries more than doubled their earnings, half in a single event whose revenues paid off a sixth to a third of the capital costs. Meanwhile, competitors bled. When batteries were just 2% of South Australia's capacity, they captured 55% of that state's stability market. They cut the price of the frequency stability services 90% in 4 months, and they cut the gas peakers' revenues by 96%. So it didn't take much to transform the economics of keeping frequency stable, and that is spreading. By the end of 2021, South Australia, with no coal, no hydropower, had about 60% renewable electricity at Australia's lowest prices. All 1.3 gigawatts of load was up to 110% solar powered for over an hour, then 135% solar and wind powered, over 100% for a 93-hour period continuously. And meanwhile, they used fuel-free synchronous condensers, basically old generators with nothing driving the shaft, but run as motors. And they used those so-called syncons to cut gas-fired generation to just the minimum 4.4% mandated then by the regulator. Well, in 2021, the grid operator, Transgrid, for New South Wales and Australia Capital Territory, Canberra, they even showed how Australia could phase out all coal power by 2032 and reach 100% renewable electricity by 2035. Well, none too soon. Early February 2023, Australia's two major coal states, New South Wales and Queensland, struggled to keep the lights on as a heat wave coincided with failures, outages at major multiple coal plants. By mid-year, batteries had passed coal as Australia's biggest provider of frequency control and other ancillary services. In 2024, Ancillary services earned the battery owner 69 million Australian dollars net. And batteries tripled to 165 million Aussie dollars that year's net revenue from arbitrage. That is, charge your batteries at lower negative prices and sell back at high prices and pocket the difference. The less reliable those old lignite plants get, the greater the profitable price volatility. The more profitable the batteries, the more batteries get built. And that's good because meanwhile, renewables are taking coal power's market, so more operators want storage. The grid operator figured it would take about 159 gigawatts of variable renewables and 33 of dispatchable storage to run all of Australia all on renewables. Well, 7 gigawatts of batteries are under construction in early 2025. Bloomberg forecasts 11 by 2027 and accelerating. Let me conclude this section with 5 slides about the energy transition and global development. In the early 1980s, I learned from China's eminent economist Ma Hong, founder of the State Council's Development Research Center, how China had bought over 100 refrigerator factories to raise ownership of refrigerators in Greater Beijing from a few percent to over 60%. Trouble was, it turned out the factories were cheap because they made inefficient refrigerators, and those caused really costly shortages of power and capital. So Ma Hong's lesson to me was that development is affordable only if it rests on a foundation of resource efficiency. Otherwise, the supply side devours the capital that you need to build the things that were supposed to use the energy and resources. Well, applying that learning in 1991, Ashok Gadgil, who now leads Berkeley Lab's efficiency work, and I analyzed the electricity revolution's gigantic yet little noticed opportunity to reallocate a lot of financial capital. Using World Bank data, we found that if you invest to make energy-saving technologies like modern lamps and heat-blocking window films, you'll need about 1,000 times less capital, and you'll get it back about 10 times faster than if you build fossil-fueled power plants and grids to add the same services with normally inefficient end-use devices. So buying negawatts whenever they're cheaper than megawatts, which is virtually always, can cut by roughly 10,000-fold capital intensity divided by capital velocity, the capital needs of the most capital-intensive sector, electricity, which gobbles a fourth of global development capital. And that frees up precious capital in very large amounts for other development needs. This is the most powerful macroeconomic lever we know for development. Finance ministers just need to find the fulcrum. Oddly, when I talk to those ministers, very few of them have ever heard this story, and it's time they did. Meanwhile, the synergy between efficient use and distributed renewables speeds affordable energy access for all. A life-or-death daily issue for most of 1 billion people, mainly in Africa, who after sundown still live in darkness. Remember the old story about how the whalers went broke by overlooking Michael Dietz's new lamp? Well, the last chapter is now playing out in oil's last lighting market, which, as of 2005, Evan Mills found if it were a country, would rank 8th in carbon emissions. It was then killing about 4 million people a year. I'm talking about the kerosene lamps in the huts and hovels of, at that time, 1.2 billion people with family income $2 a day or less, and little prospect of getting or affording grid electricity. And yet they were paying $38 billion a year, a fifth of the total cost of global lighting, to produce very inefficiently 1,000th of the world's light. 1,000th the light for a fifth the cost. But now they can banish darkness and teach their daughters and sons to read. Because an entrepreneurial village woman can sell or lease them an integrated photovoltaic LED lithium battery smart chip lighting package. I'll bring one to class, like this Waka Waka, that yellow object at the upper right. It pays back in weeks to months. It could be microfinanced via the smartphone that it recharges through its USB port. No longer buying the kerosene earns a perpetual annuity equal to a month's extra income each year for that family. So there goes the last bit of John D. Rockefeller's 160-year-old kerosene business. We won't miss it. Which of these two offerings is more exciting, more healthful, more lucrative, more secure? To which of these strategies would you entrust your company's fate and our common future? Most of all, for those most in need, durable and affordable solutions start with, surprise, strong end-use efficiency. Berkeley Lab uses photovoltaics a third smaller than in this picture to run all the stuff illustrated. 7,000 looks of LEDs, a mobile phone charger, a clock radio, a table fan, and a 56-centimeter color television. So this entire suite of life-changing appliances uses 27 watts. Their high efficiencies cut the system's total capital cost by half, empowering, therefore, twice as many off-grid families for the same money and enabling cheap and highly reliable DC solar microgrids. Ashok Jhunjhunwala got the World IEEE Award a few years ago for pointing out that and showing in the field that you could make the photovoltaics, the batteries, and the end-use devices all at the same DC voltage, 12, 24, 48, they're all on the market. Then there's no inverter, so the system gets cheaper and more reliable. Now, this appliance suite can, of course, be extended. For example, there's a Dutch low-voltage vacuum-insulated refrigerator that uses an average of 8 watts. We learned earlier about biomimetic fan rotors, several-fold more efficient than normal fans, and probably better than the one in the picture. And I guess I need to go back to Berkeley Lab and say, if you were doing this today, how much lower would the 27 watts be? But meanwhile, there's a website called Verasol, verasol.org, that compares data for hundreds of quality certified off-grid solar appliances, ideal for Africa and Asia, to help pick the most efficient models and foster quality and competition. Now, to free girls and women from gathering wood and dung for cooking, there's been a lot of wonderful work on efficient stoves, but how about smarter pots that could be at least as important and might be culturally easier, but they're scarcely on the agenda? Many of the proven improvements illustrated here are on the market separately. They could be combined and adapted by ingenious local metalsmiths to local skills and needs, designed cleanably, durably, and integrated with the stoves. You should, of course, integrate all options, and those include good old ideas: lower heated mass, better insulation, even in a hay box when you're not cooking, direct immersion, direct contact, fast regulation. And together, my back of the envelope calc suggests it may be possible to cut cooking energy by 1 or perhaps 2 orders of magnitude. That's before we use solar power or solar heat, which would get correspondingly cheaper and easier. After many years, some leading developing country cook stove experts are just starting to add pots to their agenda. Another nice example of enlarging the system boundary. What about the food you're cooking? Well, agriculture withdraws about 90% of India's water, with electric pumps using about 19% of total electricity. Connected load for that is officially 100 gigawatts. It may actually be 150. Plus, even worse, diesel pumps that devour 60% of farm income and $3 billion a year in foreign exchange. But Indian field trials show how end-to-end redesign can improve system efficiency by at least 5-fold, take pumping off the grid, feed surplus solar power back into the grid, creating solar farmers year-round, help make distribution companies solvent, and eliminate the $10 billion a year subsidy. All these pieces exist. Some are being begun in some states, some assembly required. Now, these past few slides have opened the door to the vital links between energy and agriculture and water. I hope some of you will pursue them. And remember that these cornerstones of leapfrog global development are already making the energy transformation faster and cheaper everywhere. India has some of the world's cheapest solar power stations, not only because of cheap labor, but also because of innovation. Same for China. Societies with well over a billion people each are bound to have a lot of great ideas. Rapid innovation, spurred by need and sped by talent in the global south, including the million engineers graduated each year in China and India, can stimulate the north too. The enormous volume of efficiency and renewable buildup needed for fair development in the south will drop costs for everyone. Case in point, Chinese solar, and there are many more. So we should think of energy transformation for global development not only as helping the South get better lives, but also as enabling success and security in the North. At the other end of the world's agricultural spectrum, Evan Mills, who pioneered efficient lighting for poor off-grid families, has turned his care and clarity on analyzing the methods, metrics, impacts, and options for the U.S. cannabis industry. Its indoor cultivation turns out to use about 1% of U.S. electricity, costing $11 billion a year and tying up 12 gigawatts. The resulting carbon emissions are comparable to those of all outdoor U.S. agriculture. Here's a graphical abstract of his thorough open source review. I offer this just as a little example of unexpected consequences, easily overlooked and readily correctable. Notice what happens in the bottom bar of the graph when you move the cultivation outdoors, as agriculture is supposed to be. Okay, after you've digested this first of our two lectures on implications, I invite you to continue with Lecture 8B. Thank you.